When we hear the term clipping, a lot of the time it's used in a negative way. The input clipped, or that plugin is clipping. But the outcome of clipping isn't always the same. It isn't always irretrievable, and it certainly isn't always bad. Sometimes it's actually extremely useful. Let's find out why. Typically when we talk about clipping, we're talking about an occasion where one stage is overloading the next. The microphone preamp is turned up too loud, so it clips the input of the analog to digital converter, or the output of one plugin is too high, so it's clipped the input of the next. The elephant in the room here is that the best way to avoid having to deal with clipping is to gain stage properly in the first place. I know that doesn't really help if your audio is already clipped, but if you want a refresher on gain staging to make sure you're getting things right in the first place, check out this video at the top now. But to understand clipping, we really need to understand the difference between analog and digital systems, because they operate very differently, especially when clipping is concerned. Clipping in the analog world, for example, can be advantageous to the sound. The best and probably most extreme example of this is in a distorted guitar amp. The reason that the gain knob creates that distortion is because it's increasing the level of the instrument at the input stage, going into the next stage. As you increase the level with the gain knob, more of the signal is being clipped. Often in guitar terminology we would call this distortion, but here it's essentially the same thing. You're driving the input high, so it's reaching the point of clipping sooner, and it's pushing more signal into the valves or transistors or whatever is in the circuitry of the amplifier, and causing it to square off the signal and create a distorted guitar tone that we're all familiar with. But to say it's squaring off the signal isn't entirely accurate. In the analog world, we're not actually creating completely leveled off peaks. Even when using analog tape, this is a relatively gentle kind of clipping that we would be more inclined to call saturation. Saturation deals with more than just clipped peaks, of course. It also affects harmonics in a signal more so than hard clipping will, but the effect on the peaks is essentially doing a very similar thing. So clipping in the analog world, really driving a guitar amp or the level going to analog tape, is often romanticized and seen as a great characteristic to impart on a sound. Analog can be forgiving, and overdriving a signal is often going to add the overall vibe of the sound. This is because the analog clipping is far gentler and has more of a soft knee characteristic compared to digital clipping, which is instantaneous and absolute. Digital clipping is far less forgiving, and a clipped signal is just that, clipped. But this doesn't mean there's nothing we can do about it, and it certainly doesn't mean that all is lost simply because something has gone over that 0 dB FS peak. There's a couple of things to look at here. Firstly, how can we recover samples that have been clipped? Well, what instantly springs to my mind would be D-Clip within iZotope RX, which can recover and repair clipped samples, making it seem like nothing was ever clipped in the first place. If we take a listen to this piece of dialogue before and after D-Clip has been applied, you'll hear why it's such a powerful tool. Even if samples have clipped at the preamp, we can still bring them back to life. Even if samples have clipped at the preamp, we can still bring them back to life. Typically we're recording in 24-bit, which means that there is a usable dynamic range of 144 decibels. Essentially we can record quiet and loud sounds, but if the difference between the two is more than 144 decibels, we're either going to have issues with noise or with clipping. But most modern DAWs will be working internally at 32 or even 64-bit float, which means that we actually have a dynamic range of over 1500 dB to work with. In fixed point formats like 16 or 24-bit, we essentially have a fixed range of values to store audio in. You can almost imagine this like a digital canvas where one pixel equates to one value, represented by a 24-bit word. In that paradigm, a pixel is a pixel, and you can't make the canvas any bigger. With floating point though, we can zoom in and zoom out of that canvas. When we zoom in, we actually gain resolution, so we can work with quieter signals before they disappear into the noise floor. When we zoom out, we lose a little resolution for very quiet signals, but we can also deal with signals far louder than 0 dBFS without any actual clipping. What's more, we can optimize the zoom level for every single sample to maximize the trade-off between resolution and accuracy. So even if we're clipping the output of a plugin, that doesn't actually mean that the louder sections are being clipped and lost forever. Here I have a session with Ozone on the main output. I've boosted the input of Ozone by 10 dB, so I am clipping the input. Then I've attenuated the output by 10 dB, so the main output isn't reading above 0 dBFS. If I bounce this track out and view it in RX, we can see that the full dynamics of the track are intact because although the input of Ozone was clipping, it's working internally at a higher bit depth, so attenuating the output simply brings down the level of the track to its original volume, and no clipping has taken place. Similarly, if I keep the input at unity and boost the output of Ozone by 10 dB, then attenuate the main output fader and bounce at 24-bit, we can see in RX that there is no clipping taking place, again due to Ozone working internally at a higher bit depth. In fact, both versions are identical, and neither are clipped. And this is also true for bouncing masters out of a session, even if they're clipped on the main output, as long as we export in 32-bit float. Here I have a session where I've just imported the track stems and the main output of my DAW is clipping. I'm going to bounce this in two different ways, one in 24-bit and the other in 32-bit float. Once we bring them into RX, we can see that they look the same. Both have peaks that go beyond 0 dB FS. If I use the gain module to turn each of these down by 12 dB, we will see where the differences lie. The 24-bit version is attenuated by 12 dB, but the squashed peaks still remain. That information has been lost in this export. Whereas in the 32-bit version, I can attenuate by 12 dB and the peaks will come back. Exporting at a higher bit depth has meant that we have retained the peaks within the file, and by bringing down the overall level, we can see them again. Soft clippers are often used in mixing when we want to shave off some transient information without being overly aggressive. Soft clippers work in a way that will gradually round off the peaks of a signal in a far gentler way than a hard limiter would. By starting to apply gain reduction earlier, soft clippers can be gentler on peaks. If a brick wall limiter has a threshold set to -5 dB, for example, that's the point at which it's limiting. There's no gentle slope involved. A soft clipper, however, will start gain reduction far earlier, and depending on the shape of soft clipping you're applying, in Ozone you have three shapes: low, moderate and heavy. The sooner it will start. When set to heavy, soft clipping will occur earlier, so it will be clipping more of the signal. But when working down through moderate and light, clipping will occur later and will only be affecting the louder portions of the signal, so will be less noticeable. In fact, in Ozone, the soft clip module sits before the limiter, so it's shaving off the peaks of the signal in a gentler way, before the more heavy-handed limiter takes hold, so it's not making the limiter work as hard by sharing the load and shaving off the peaks gradually beforehand. Limiters are the real classic way of squashing transients in a mix, and more typically in a master, but even conventional limiters can't be said to stop every single piece of digital signal from reaching the point of clipping, which is why we have the option to use a true peak limiter. A true peak limiter is a brick wall limiter that uses oversampling to more accurately follow and control peak levels. With a conventional limiter, it's possible and often probable that intersample peaks will exceed the threshold set by our limiter. This is why the oversampling in a true peak limiter is so important. It reads between the lines, in between the samples of the original sample rate, and catches any peaks that got through the net of the regular limiter by working internally at a higher sample rate. A higher sample rate means it's sampling the signal more times per second, so it's able to be more accurate. If a limiter working at 48 kHz, for example, has a set threshold but peaks exist in between those samples, then a true peak limiter detecting at 192 kHz will be able to control the peaks sitting in between those samples. Here I've exported a mix twice, once with true peak engaged on the limiter and once without. On the version with true peak engaged, we can see in RX's waveform stats that there are no possibly clipped samples. On the version without true peak engaged, it's a different story, and the limiter has let some intersample peaks through the net. It's fair to say that clipping isn't always as bad as it's made out to be. Clipping in a creative sense, such as saturation or soft clipping, can have a desirable impact on the sound and create a certain sound. Digital clipping, whilst generally thought of as a bad thing, isn't always game over for your audio. There are ways and means to bring it back to life after clipping has taken place. If thought is given to bit depth and gain staging in the first place, you don't need to let clipping be an issue in your productions. Thanks so much for watching. If you have any strategies for dealing with clipping in your workflows, leave them in the comments. I'll see you again soon. Take care.